So welcome to Bicon's weekly Hadian podcast. I'm delighted to say that we have with us David Rosenberg, who's the Haaretz business commentator, who recently wrote a book, Israel's Technology Economy, Origins and Impact, which is published by Palgrave Macmillan. It came out in May. And really great to have you with us, David, here in London, in the office. Welcome to sunny London.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So what we're going to talk about is this issue which I think a lot of our listeners are fascinated and enthralled by, which is the Israeli tech boom. And I think really let's start off with a discussion of, what actually drove the Israeli tech boom. I mean, in your book, you look in quite a lot of detail at the origins, and I think what would be interesting is to hear a summary from you about what actually made this happen.
I think it was two converging trends, one going deep into Zionist and Israeli history, or maybe even to Jewish history, and the other, the global world of technology and communications that came together in the 1990s. If you look at the first side of this convergence, you go back to early Zionist values, which involved high level of individualism and kind of contradictory notions at one time of group identification and teamwork, and on the other hand, a very kind of what we call kind of Dugri culture of direct talk, little respect for old values and old ways of doing things. And that was expressed early in the Zionist movement in any number of ways. Those values were imparted through the pre-state militia, the Palmach, and into the Israeli army. And through there pervaded all of Israeli society. And that, on a cultural level or at a social level, was very, very critical to the world of high tech. We tend to think of it in terms of science and engineering, but the fact is a lot of it is predicated on values and thinking out of the box constantly, not respecting old ideas or assuming things have to be done the way they are. And so I think that was a very, very critical part of the emergence of high tech in Israel. On the other side of the convergence was what was happening in the world of global technology. On the one hand, in the 1990s and even going back to the 1980s, was the rise of the internet, which created all kinds of new opportunities, both in terms of technology and in markets, for companies, for new companies, basically startups. Then you had the whole issue of deregulation of the telecommunications world. Until that era, in nearly every country in the world, telecommunications was a government monopoly. All the equipment and the technology was provided by big multinational companies, or often very local heroes. Companies that had very close and unbreakable ties with the monopoly. Deregulation broke up that relationship and allowed new companies and new technologies and new businesses to compete. So between I think Israeli culture and the growing, plurality or of world technology allowed all of this to happen. It would have been impossible in the 1950s and 1960s. By 1990, the right formula was there.
How important do you think the role of the Israel Defense Forces and this huge investment in the need to develop new technology, to be always having this qualitative edge, was there as a foundation for the Israeli tech boom?
That is also a very important thing. I probably should have mentioned in the first place, is that very early on, and it was one of the other great contradictions of the Zionist movement, was on the one hand, there was a very strong feeling that the new Jew will be a farmer or a worker proletariat. On the other hand, very early in the movement's history, there were already universities, starting with the Technion in 1912 and going on to the Weizmann Institute and Hebrew University and so forth, so that for a country of its size and certainly of its location and stage of material development, you might say, Israel had an extraordinarily big workforce of scientists, researchers, and engineers. You combine that with some of the problems Israel faced in terms of defense, which was it was a very, very small country surrounded by hostile neighbors with much bigger populations, and plus the unreliable supply of weaponry. Most famously, Charles de Gaulle deciding to cut off supplies to Israel before the '67 war. You would say in many other cases, a lot of countries would have just given up the whole idea. I think it was the Israeli and Zionist mentality, we might call the Sabra mentality, that says we have a problem, we're going to solve it, and marshaled resources to do it, and created not so much a defense industry. Israel does build tanks and does build planes, but basically the industry is based on electronics and upgrades to the big platforms, which was something that was, in terms of Israel's size, was feasible, and as it turns out, gave a big push to the technology industry by creating a base for it to start off with, even before the technology revolution of the 1990s.
And one of the things that's interesting about how we analyse it now is how big is this sector? And can it carry the whole economy? Because I've certainly, read commentary that sort of says, this is a great part of our economy, but you can almost see it as like the icing on top of the cake, and that they're not actually, it's not necessarily benefiting and growing what's underneath it. Like, yes, maybe it's 10% of the economy, but maybe it's not such a huge employer in terms of the amount of people in jobs. And is it actually having a knock-on in any way and affecting the structure of the rest of the economy? Is it like an island that's doing really well and not necessarily benefiting the rest? I'm interested to get your thoughts on that.
I think you characterize this situation quite well. I think one of the downsides to Israeli technology culture is the resistance to authority and hierarchy and so forth plays out in a negative way, which is it's very hard for Israeli companies to adapt the discipline and organization of a big multinational company. So on the side of innovation, Israelis are very, very good. They're out there in front. When it comes to creating a sustainable business plan and organization, and a company that not just comes up with a great new product, but then proceeds, to go on to generation 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0 and so forth, is much, much more difficult. The result of all of that is Israel is known as startup nation for a good reason. Is we have lots and lots of startups. On a per capita basis, it's crazy the number of startups Israel has, but very rarely do those companies grow beyond the startup stage. The typical trajectory for them is the company started up, it develops a product, it might even go to market with it, but very quickly it will put itself up for sale to a big multinational. And that's essentially the history of almost all Israeli high technology to this day. And the result is startups are very sexy, but they don't employ a lot of people. I have examples of companies that were sold for hundreds of millions of dollars, and they employ 20, 30, 40 people, sometimes not even that. There was one PayPal bought that probably had 15 people. And there's not any knock on either. It's not as if these companies do a lot of subcontract or anything like that. I think the typical startup, after it buys a few computers and so forth, its basic needs outside of the company itself are maybe take out pizza periodically.
So there's no supply chain.
Exactly. So you take an example, it's not an Israeli company, but it's a company that works in Israel, which is Intel, which does a huge amount of R&D, but it also has a big semiconductor fabrication facility. The result is it's one of Israel's biggest exporters. And employs, I think it's more than 10,000 people now, and that's just one company. Most of them are working in the production plant, not in R&D. The fact is there's no Israeli tech company that works on that scale at all. The closest is Israel Aerospace, which is a government company and doesn't really count. And that makes a big difference. And we're seeing that in the fact that even in Israel, there's a ceiling to how many startup companies an economy can produce. In other words, a limited number of people who have the talent to be entrepreneurs, at least successful entrepreneurs, and even then, there's a limit to how many they have engineers, and we're running into a supply problem with that as well. The result has been that the number of startups is actually new startups, I should say, has been falling slightly in the last couple of years.
I wanted to ask you about that because I think, bring it back to the UK, that's a problem we have here, and just as we have a problem of lots of startups and asking the question why is there not a British Facebook? I guess it's the same question in Israel, and maybe that's part of the structure of the high-tech industry. But this issue about the pipeline of engineers and how do you create the next generation or keep that flow going? And I guess it's two issues, isn't it? It's immigration and the right to work, and it's also education into the future. And we're asking exactly the same questions in the UK. I'm interested to know what you think the limitations are and the solutions are, both on getting people into work perhaps from abroad and also educating the next generation.
Yeah. So Israel works on a couple of different levels. One is the number of graduates turned out by the universities, and by the way, by the army as well, which is a major source of high-tech talent, especially entrepreneurial talent. That problem is more or less being addressed. And actually, this coming academic year, the number of students in engineering programs rose considerably.
Okay.
The bigger challenge is, I think in Israel, like everywhere else in the world, high-tech tends to be an industry of young white men. There are relatively few women in high-tech, with maybe the exception of biotechnology. In Israel, there are very few Israeli Arabs in the industry, and certainly there are very few ultra-Orthodox Jews. For each of these sectors, there's a vast, on paper at least, there's a vast pool of labor available. The catches each present special problems. In the case of women, there's simply, I think there's an employment preference or study preference away from computer science and engineering, which is very hard to break. In any case, it's something that has to be dealt with by the schools and by the universities. It's, by the time a high-tech company comes out to recruit, if there are no women computer science engineers graduates, then there's nobody to hire, and that's the end of the story. I think that's...
Quickly. 1, 2. Yeah, that's not 2.
It's changing a little bit, probably not fast enough. Vis-a-vis Israeli Arabs, I think the supply in terms of Israeli Arabs who are attending university and getting relevant degrees has grown exponentially, especially among women. And I think it's happening slowly, but that labor pool is also being tapped. And I think it's part of a wider social trend in Israel towards greater integration of Israeli Arabs in the workforce and even into Israeli society, which is very much underreported. The third area is the Haredim, and I think that presents a very deep problem because here you have a community that's resistant to the idea of secular education to begin with, a little suspicious about people who want to pursue careers, serious careers that is, and has problems with some of the values of the high-tech world in general. I mean, certainly between intermingling between the sexes is one, but I think on a deeper level, the kind of free and easy atmosphere and the values I was talking about at the beginning of questioning authority and traditions and old values and so forth, and thinking differently is not something the Haredi community values very much. I'm not saying it's an impossible thing to square, but it's going to be kind of difficult. The interesting thing about Israel, most countries facing this problem say, well, the solution is to allow more immigration of skilled professionals. Israel is not too inclined in that direction. There are now some programs to do that on a very, very small scale, but I think it's not unique to Israeli society, as we now know, but I think there's a lot of fears about being overwhelmed by foreign engineers and so forth, and the Israelis would find they can't get jobs because there are people coming in from abroad.
It's similar here,
I think it's not unique at all to Israel. So I think that outlet for now is closed off. But the fact is, there's such a domestic work pool that has not been tapped that I don't think it's absolutely critical. The question all around is, because I think high-tech in Israel and in general is very cultural, in other words, these are very specific Israeli Sabra values, it's, in the case of women, Israeli women, I think they share that. In the case of Israeli Arabs and Haredim, I think they don't. And that, it's not simply a matter of, he's got a degree now in computer science, he's now ready to work in Startup Nation. I think it's deeper than that, but I don't think it's an impossible thing to surmount.
And I think in the book you're quite critical about the Israeli education system, like its quality, and I think that's also, anyone looking at the tech sector will be asking questions about, at what age do we start our kids coding, and to what extent are we giving them the kind of push to go into what we call here like the STEM subjects, and it's always an angst to like how high is the quality of the teaching there, and how much are we actually pushing people into that rather than say the humanities. And I wonder if you could just expand some of your criticisms of the Israeli education sector.
I have many of them, but I think in general you could say that first of all, by international standards, it's very poor. It's not a question even of whether there's too much emphasis on humanities or versus science or anything like that. The fact is, it does a bad job of teaching everything, so it really doesn't make a lot of difference. And that, you can see in international exams. I don't think it's an arguable subject, although some people would say the exams aren't reflective. I think what's happened in Israel is that there, I would hesitate to call it an elite, but say, the top 10% of students, first of all, don't need good or bad schools. They'll succeed no matter what. In case where they don't succeed, they'll be found by the Army, which does a very, very systematic and good job of selecting the best people, not just for technology units, but as Air Force pilots and for elite combat units and so forth. And a lot of the shortfalls of the education system get rectified by the Army, and if not by that, simply by a certain number of people who can succeed under all circumstances. What happens is those people tend to be the ones who work in high-tech startup companies, come up with the brilliant new innovations. And there's a ceiling, as we're finding, is if the schools don't produce simply good students with the skills and talents, skills necessary, there's a limit to how many people you can rely on simply to succeed by dint of their own intelligence and personality. And I think how it plays out is that one of the reasons that Israel is such a center for startups, but not a center for big technology companies, is once you fall beneath the surface of that, say top 10% or so, the level of workplace skills and education falls precipitously. And so you could have, an entrepreneur. He, recruits some friends of his from Army intelligence unit he worked with, and they've got a core people of 2 or 3, and then they go down maybe 10 or 15 more as the startup expands. Then they start digging down further, and they need more people, and it becomes more and more difficult, because you can't assume that somebody who exited the Israeli school system necessarily has the skills. We're not talking about people who are necessarily going to come up with the next waves. We're talking about people who are in charge of marketing, for instance. You don't have to be in engineering or any other kind of genius. You just have to be somebody with a level of skills and insights and so forth. And I think that's where a big element of why Israel hasn't been able to capitalize on the startup phenomenon. It's not simply a matter of, as some people like to say, greedy venture capitalists want to cash out, or entrepreneurs. I think a lot of it is simply the human resources to build a big company aren't there. They're just in such short supply that most companies, startups, simply say at a certain point, we can't do it anymore. We'll just sell out, and as they typically do, become an R&D center for a big multinational.
And you see that trend continuing?
So far, I don't see any sign. I mean, I think this is one. There's not a fundamental change in how the schools work. A little improvement here and there, but in any case, it'll take a decade or more for that to filter into the economy, because we're talking about changes that are happening now on the elementary school level, and there's going to be 15 years before these kids are out in the workforce. So we'll see, but I think it's a serious problem. And my guess would be, not knowing too much about how things operate in the UK, there's probably an issue of that as well elsewhere. I think in Israel, it's very, very it's extreme.
Yes. Understood. So just finally, I wanted to talk about the kind of view from Britain, and it's interesting that with everything happening with Brexit, Britain has prioritised the Israeli market as an important market to be expanding in, and I think that certainly a lot of the research we've done about Britain-Israeli trade after Brexit, that Israel is exactly the kind of economy that Britain would want to have a strong relationship with, expanding trade relationship with after Brexit. You know, it's dynamic, it's innovative, there's high levels of spending on R&D, but there's also something that we unearthed in our research of a kind of natural marriage in tech between sort of the Israeli expertise in hardware and systems and the British expertise kind of more in marketing and some of those other bits and pieces, certainly on branding as well. There aren't that many British companies that are setting up innovation centres in Israel, apart from a few banks, and certainly we discovered that there's quite a lot from other European countries, there's a lot from America and China. What would you say to British companies that the Israeli market can offer them?
I think there's an interesting point between nexus between British industry and Israeli high technology in the sense, and I think China has learned this lesson, so has India, and even I would say the German Chancellor Angela Merkel has also expressed the same feeling, which is, we have the industry, we have the big companies. What we're lacking in is real state-of-the-art, cutting-edge innovation. And you have on the other side, Israel's very good at innovation. It's not very good at doing much with it, and that they could create a very good synergy between companies that have this abilities in marketing, production, and so forth to leverage Israeli innovation. The interesting thing is, because Israel is powerful on innovation and not on anything else, Israeli companies are wide open to doing it. I think if you go to Silicon Valley, even most startups think of themselves in terms of, we're going to conquer this market, and we're certainly not interested in working with a big multinational who's going to take our technology and get all the value added out of it by producing products from it. Israeli startups don't think that way at all. I think they know the limitations. Israel's a small country. Nobody's trying to be the next Facebook, certainly not the next Apple or Intel. And so they're much, much more open to these kind of marriages of business acumen with innovation acumen. And I think certainly the Chinese recognize that, more belatedly the Indians do, and I think British companies should look in those terms as well.
Very interesting. Well, David, we're going to leave it there, but thank you so much. Just a reminder, David's book, Israel's Technology Economy, was published in May by Palgrave Macmillan. Do look out for it, and David will also be writing for Fathom in the weeks ahead. So thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.